Welcome to the J. Scott Outdoors podcast. Today we have the good friend of the podcast, Chris Roe of Roe Hunting Resources on the line. Chris, how you doing?
Doing all right, my friend. How are you?
Good. Where have we found you today?
This is on the far east side of Kansas. I'm in Lawrence. I'm getting ready to I've got an elk seminar that I'm going to be doing with the Elk Foundation here tonight at Overton's, John Overton Archery Center here in Lawrence, Kansas, and then do a little bit more work, and then I'll be heading home. But yeah, far east side of Kansas this time.
Nice. Well, I'm sure those guys will get a lot of value out of that seminar. We got a lot to talk about. The last I think we talked was kind of maybe after the youth season and then maybe rolling into the general season of turkey there in Kansas. I was headed Gould's turkey hunting. We talked about the white-faced strutter. We talked about some of that stuff. We might as well start at the top. And how was your turkey season this year in Kansas now that it's all over with?
It ended up really, really good. I was kind of worried. I think when we talked originally, if I remember right, it was still dry. We were just brutally dry. And out here, winter wheat is king. So if you've got good winter wheat, you've got the birds. If you don't, well, then you got to kind of wait for things to really kind of start to green up, and then it's kind of hit or miss on where those birds are going to go. Well, luckily, we got hit with a couple of rainstorms. It didn't drop a lot of rain, but it dumped enough that it really kicked our winter wheat in gear, and man, we had birds pile in. So yeah, we were able to I let all of our hunters upgrade to 2 birds if they wanted to, and everybody, we sat at right about a 99% success rate. The only guy that did not get his bird, we focused on getting his son his bird first, and then went out and hunted it, and we purposely went after 2 of the biggest, oldest birds that we knew of, and it was late season, so it's tough to begin with, and we found these 2 giants. The late season out here can get pretty tough, and the birds will end up on their summer mode. Well, it was such a cold spring where everything was delayed. And so we had this kind of mishmash of some birds were still locked down hard with hens. Other birds were they were just done. They were just off on their own, and they didn't care. Well, we kept talking about, and you know this from guys, you start getting the later season, you really want to try to find those birds that are cruising in between. Maybe they've lost their hens are done, but they just start running the landscape looking for those last available hens. Well, we kept trying to find some birds like that, and just everything was locked down. Everything just didn't want to work. So we find these 2 giants. We split up. He goes in, gets set up. I'm several hundred yards back away. My goal was just a call to keep them talking. Dude, we should have just stayed right where those birds were hot, and they came like a freight train. I mean, just come smoking at me. Well, by luck of all stupid luck, the route they decided to take was not he was crouched hiding behind the cedar tree, and these 2 birds walked right to the other side of the cedar tree that he was on. And I mean, they snuck around. They start coming around the side of the cedar tree. Well, they're like 3-5 feet away, and so when they get there, all of a sudden they see something not right. They start to putt. They start to run. He jumps up, tries to swing and shoot. Well, you're 10 foot away with an extra full turkey choke. I mean, you better be a surgeon with that thing. And so, first shot missed. Boom. Now the birds are just doing Mach 30, flying. He took a second shot, missed, and by this time they were gone. And he just sat there, just like, what just happened? So that's the only guy that didn't throw his tag. And I got it all on video. He's a good friend of mine, Steve Fernandez. Love the guy to death. He's a guide himself down in New Mexico, so he knows what he's doing. The guy's legit. But it just was one of those comical. It was a great trip, great fun. But we just ran out of time. He just had a 2-day deal that he could do, and so That's the only one that didn't fill, but it ended up being a really, really good season. I did shut things down early again. We only hunted until that first week of May, just because I always try to leave some mature birds for next year, so I don't want to just whack the bejeebas out of all the mature birds we have. So I shut everything down beginning of May, and we had birds gobbling and strutting out in fields all the way here up through last week, actually. So,
wow, Chris, one question for you. Talking about I have several questions. One is the strategy of getting back a couple hundred yards. I assume it's a similar strategy to what you hear sometimes guys trying to do with elk, which I'm not a huge believer in, but was your strategy somewhat of a kind of I'll keep them going, almost you're going to kind of bushwhack them type of method, or what? Like, talk a little bit about
absolutely.
That strategy, and is that strategy something you use very often, or is that more like, all right, these are two big birds, we're going to have to pull out all the tricks to make this happen?
Yeah, right there. You nailed it. See, what was going on, again, for people that have not hunted out in my country or in some of that open Rio Grande country, we have lots of open agriculture and these skinny little corridors of cover and where the trees are. And so when we start getting late season, especially when you're dealing with older, more mature birds, you and I both hear it all the time. People say, the hardest bird to kill is an eastern, or the hardest bird to kill is a Mississippi bird, or birds get smart if they are hunted, whether it's by humans, by predators, or whatever. The older the bird gets, the smarter they're going to get, and they know how to survive. Number one. Number two, again, biologically, behaviorally, the hen is supposed to go to the gobbler. That's why he strokes. That's why he gobbles. So in our area, especially when you start getting late season, and when those birds are locked down with those hens, they will be out in the wide open ag fields, sometimes hundreds of yards away from any sort of cover whatsoever. And while anybody listening that follows turkey hunting, you see those little scoot and shoot type deals, or the little turkey fans that you can put on your shotgun and you can crawl out there with them, and the birds come attacking the turkey fan. Well, yes, that can happen, but usually from a behavior cycle, that's early in the season. Late season, they fought everybody they want to fight. They don't want to fight anymore. They're just on their own, and if they've got one or two hens left, they'll just stick with them things like glue, and they'll just sit there and listen to, or look at you. Now, they might gobble at you from a distance, but they're not going to budge. Well, so in that case, what you described is exactly that, and you're right. There's a lot of people that'll do that for elk, especially during rifle season. Sometimes the bulls will bugle at you from a distance, but then once you get in close, they just go silent. Well, if you've got a buddy, one person hang back, keep them bugling, the other person try to sneak in. Well, that's what we were going to do. Again, like I said, Steve, he's a professional guide. He takes clients. He works for a high dollar outfit, a really high quality outfit, and his hunters are. He averages usually pretty darn close to 100% success rate on taking all of his hunters. The guy's good. He knows what he's doing. Turkeys and elk. We're just hunting as friends and just tag teaming. Well, so Steve knew what if Steve got in close, he knew what he needed to do. What I said is, I tell you what, this bird, they're out in the middle of the field. I'm just going to be back here and crank on a box call, because they were gobbling. Boom, boom, they would gobble at it. But all the other birds that we had encountered up until that point, they'd gobble, but they would stay in the open, and they'd just kind of skirt from hilltop to hilltop, or they'd stay out in these open little areas. Well, where these birds were and the direction that they were traveling and where I could set up and keep them gobbling, it was a made and ready situation where Steve could move forward and get himself set up way ahead of the birds on this little finger of cover as those birds worked their way to get to the hilltop where they should be able to see me and should be able to gobble and try to kind of periscope their necks up and just kind of see what's going on. He would have been right smack dab in range, and if he needed to make a few calls here or there, he could have easily done it. But my job was just to try to keep them gobbling so that he could get in there and get close. Because the other thing, too, is difficult to figure out, just on their own. They're locked down with just with one hen. And so, yeah, that is not a tactic I use all the time. It's very rare that I do that. And most of the time we can set up and work the birds just like, what I'd say traditional. You hear them gobble, you move in close, you get set up, and boom, boom, call them in. Most of the time, that's what we're doing. This was one of those rare occurrences where doing that type of, splitting up, keeping the birds talking, was, in our mind, the most legitimate play to kill those suckers. Well, he got halfway to where he was wanting to be, and these birds started coming, and they just flat. They were the textbook birds that we all just killed or die to have. Every time I hit that box call or the mouth call, they would gobble, and they just marched. They did not pause. They just marched, and they were on their way. If Steve had stayed there right there with me, I'll bet you we could have called them about a third of a mile off of a hill, down through a valley, up the other side to me, and we could have killed them. He would have killed both those birds. But they just caught him in a bad spot. He did everything he could do to just to make like a lump in the ground, and they just walked right up on top of him, and he had no shot opportunity until literally they were, he's looking at the scales on their legs, they were right there. It was too late. And, hindsight 2020, we talked about it after we got done laughing. We talked about it. I said, quite honestly, the best thing probably would have done is just stand up and let them run off a little bit, and then kind of pause and look back, and then he kind of probably could have shot when they were 25, 30 yards out there and probably would have dumped him because the pattern would have been better. But, you get excited. And he thought he could get her done, and it was fun.
Question, you had talked about wanting to leave mature birds on your property, and for all the listeners out there that have properties that they hunt, one would be why. Number two would be, I had some hunters asking me this question. There was a little bit of a debate, but can jakes breed the hens, and can they get the job done?
Well, to that question, yeah, absolutely, no question. Yes. Now, they may be a little clumsy at it, teenagers are teenagers, but yeah, they absolutely can, and it's been documented numbers of times. So yes, jakes can get the job done, number one. And I know that there's probably some people listening, and because this is one of those ones where you will have some controversy, especially other outfitters. One of our neighbors is an outfitter he'll whack and stack every bird that comes in that a hunter wants to shoot. They don't care if it's got a visible beard and the hunter wants to shoot it, they'll shoot it. So, there's a discussion amongst wildlife professionals when we're talking about small game populations, and there's a very generally accepted principle that you can't stockpile small game. All right. So it means, if you want to keep, you have a property for rabbits, and you have a bunch of rabbits, and so you go out and shoot a bunch of rabbits, but you say, I want to leave some rabbits, and so you try to leave some rabbits. Well, the way small game populations are, it's very difficult to just, like you said, stockpile, like hold them over for their population is going to do what their population is going to do. Now, when it comes to turkeys kind of get into that middle ground to where some people think that, yes, you can, and some people say, nah, it doesn't matter. Shoot all the mature birds that you can, because it's unlikely that a bird's going to survive. And so if you're shooting a 2-year-old, who cares? Shoot a 2-year-old. And again, especially outfitters or people that are running hunts, they're like, it doesn't matter. You can, and I did, and a couple of my hunters this year killed 2.5-year-old or 2-year-old birds that were, had 9.5, almost 10-inch beards. So they're big old honking beards. Their spurs aren't that long, but they're big-bodied birds, and they've got a big beard, and the hunter's happy, and everybody's, yay, pats each other on the back. Well, I'm in the camp of people that says no. Once a turkey reaches maturity, there's very few things that are going to kill him. Yes, a bobcat can catch a mature bird. Yes, a coyote. Yes, they can catch a mature bird. Yes, maybe you'll have a big great horned owl that wants to come in and pick off a mature bird off a limb or something like that. Sure, all those things can happen, but depending on your predator population and the pressure and all sorts of other factors, we've got in our area way too many times where you can each season get on a 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old bird. I mean, you're shooting 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches. A buddy of mine here, I showed pictures of 1 3/4 inch spurs. I mean, these things are bigger around than my pinky finger. They're huge, but big, older, more mature birds. Well, obviously, they have survived. So, from my standpoint, philosophically, this is just my personal value set. For the properties that I manage and the hunters that I take, I really do like that mystery. I like having that blend of, we know we're going to run into jakes out there, hopefully. We know we can run into 2-year-old birds. And quite honestly, as guides, as hunters, there's sometimes, boy, we love those 2-year-old birds because they're the ones that are running around gobbling their heads off, and they come running in, have a big 9.5, 10-inch beard, and bang, hunts over, and it was an eager, quick hunt. There's nothing wrong with a 2-year-old, and I'm the same, I tell everybody I'm the same way. If it's got a full fan, if that thing comes in and it struts and it's got a full fan, that bird's in trouble. Unless, of course, I'm actively going out and trying to find a big set of spurs. If I'm just out there having a fun turkey hunt, I don't care if it's a 2-year-old. If it's got a full fan and a big old beard and he plays the game and we're having fun, he's going to get smacked. However, there is something really cool about going and walking up to, shooting a bird and walking up to it and going, oh my God, and having 1.5 inch big old honking limb hanging, spurs on that thing. Or, in a couple places on my ground, I know for a fact, like these 2 birds that Steve and I got set up. These birds have been there for the past 3 years that I've been working with this property. There's no question. They use the same fields. They use the same fields the same manner. These 2 are always together. I mean, these birds, it's the same birds. There's no question. They're old. At this point, they've got to be, I don't know, 4, maybe 5 years old. There's just something really cool about having the opportunity to either just flat out luckily stumble into a mature bird and kill one, or be able to go, those birds are different. I want to target them. Let's see if we can't get this done. It just adds a dynamic to the hunt and to the landscape that I think you just don't get necessarily if all you're doing is chasing jakes and 2-year-olds. Now, granted, some of the birds are going to survive, so you might have a 3-year-old or whatever in there, but if you're just whacking and stacking and killing every bird on the landscape, all it takes, and that's the other thing, too, for us. That's the other thing. In some of these drier climates where we've had a couple bad hatches back-to-back, we've had bad storms right about the time the poults hatch that have just wiped out our spring poult survival, and then you've got a drought situation. You count on jakes turning into 2-year-olds, and then you can shoot all the 2-year-olds because you got jakes coming up the next year. Well, you go to a situation where you have 2 bad hatches or 2 failed hatches year to year. Now what? You don't have any birds. So I always try this, and I can't even put any quantitative science behind it, but just me. I try to leave about 30% of our mature birds on the landscape. I want at least to leave a third of the birds that are out there.
Do you think it makes sense? I know what you're talking about, quote unquote trophy birds, older birds, 4-year-old, 5-year-old birds, what have you. Do you believe that, if you had your choice to shoot a 2-year-old or a 5-year-old on the last day, Are those 5-year-old birds, is there a chance that they're not as productive with the hens and they're actually bullying the other birds? Or do you not think that that is, I hear that a lot. So I'm just curious if you think, some of those older, more mature birds, are they still reproducing and are they actually a detriment to your flock? Or do you feel like, no, as long as you don't have too many older birds, you should be good?
Well, actually, I don't, and by all means, anybody who's listening to this, especially the turkey guys, they're, email both of us if you've got some data, scientific data, because I don't know if there's any data that shows that, and I'm talking about peer-reviewed, good quality, not anecdotal, not somebody's opinion, but as far as scientific data, I don't know if I've ever heard that older birds are not reproductively viable. Number one, I think they are. I don't see any reason why those mature birds would not be continually reproductively viable. And while I think, yes, you probably could get in a situation where some of those older birds are kind of the bully birds, but I will be honest, in my experience, that has not been the case. In my experience, it's the younger birds that are traveling together in groups that end up being the bully birds that end up kind of running the show. Now, that's not to say that the mature bird's not still there. For instance, there's a particular, one of the birds that I killed this spring, a group of 5 gobblers were running together, and they were locked down with, literally 3 hens. And you sit there and go, 5 gobblers with 3 hens. Okay, well, when you watch the behavior, it ended up being 3 2-year-olds that were palling around, and they were just running the bejeebus out of anybody else that stepped into that field. And then there were 2 mature birds, and the mature birds were just always off. One mature bird was always with the hens, and then another mature bird was always just kind of waiting in the wings. But the 3 2-year-olds were just on the periphery of the mature bird that had the hens, and any time another gobbler stepped in the field, they would go over and just absolutely beat the ever-loving bejeebus out of them. So I think in that situation, those probably the big mature bird that had the hens, he could hold his own and probably already asserted his dominance. The 3 other ones had probably already beat up the other one. The other mature bird was probably an older bird that just couldn't fight as much as anymore. And so those 2-year-olds were just waiting for their opportunity, but they weren't going to let anybody else in that situation. And even thinking back on some of the more mature birds that we've killed, if it's been an older bird, it has either been off by itself or on the periphery of groups with younger, more, they still might have been a 3-year-old bird, but they were just a younger age class bird. They were either off on their own or they just had their own group of hens. It would be one mature bird and he'd have 3, 4, 5 hens, and then maybe on the other side of the creek bottom, here's another bird all by himself, but he's got 3, 4, 5 hens of his own. They just run their own girls. Now, like Steve and I ran into, man, again, my dream scenario is the day that big mature bird suddenly loses his last hen and he decides that it's time for me to go cruising and wants to run over anybody that is in his way to get to that last hen he hears, me calling. So I think they're always reproductively viable. And I'm sure that there might be some older birds, but man, every situation I can personally think of, most of the time it's a younger age class that are traveling together that ends up being the bullies.
Okay, that's good stuff. Anything this turkey season that jumps out at you that you learned, new stuff, or did you see any behavior or anything that perplexed you, or Just talk a little bit of, if there was something, one tactic you used or one thing you witnessed or noticed that was different.
Well, for us this year, the big thing that I think a lot of people ended up dealing with was the fact that we had such a cold April. A lot of people commented on it. Even, mid to late April, some of those mornings we'd get up and it was 19 degrees. It just was cold. And then throughout the day, it wouldn't get out of the 40s and 50s. And so even when we should have been rolling into warmer, wetter, the behavior cycle should have been a little bit more further along, it seemed like in some places the birds were just rocking and doing what they always do. In other places, they were, we started out maybe in March, things looked like they were going to be early, on a behavior cycle, and then all of a sudden that cold weather hit and it just kind of slowed everything down to where at the end of April and the beginning of May, they were still acting, some birds were still acting like they would have been in mid-April rather than in, say 2 years ago. I remember killing my last birds that first week of May. They had been done for 2 weeks. The only way that you were going to kill anything is just set up on an edge of a field and just wait for them to walk by and sluice them. I mean, they were completely done. So seeing how this year's cold weather, even though it was dry, and again, we had that drought, so I mean, there was real differences in what spring green up was and what vegetation was popping and where the birds were moving, but those cold temperatures really threw a monkey wrench into a lot of people's plans, and it was just interesting to see how things progressed across the season. I'm blessed to be able to utilize a number of properties kind of scattered out across a 4-county area to where you could definitely see a difference. These birds were early, these birds were running late, these birds were on schedule. Some of these birds were running around just going crazy, chasing hens all over the place. These birds over here were just locked down, and I mean, you couldn't have pried them off with a crowbar. So it's just a real interesting dynamic this year. And then as soon as we rolled into May, I mean, it was like someone flipped the switch, and now it's summer, and we got 90-degree temperatures, and goodness gracious. So it was kind of a squirrely year for weather, but it really was interesting to see how the birds reacted to it.
Going into the summer, you've gotten a few showers and what have you. You left some birds out there on the landscape, like you said. Can you make any predictions for next spring based on what you saw this spring, or is it just something that you can't talk about until fall and then kind of speculate from there?
Well, I think I never start booking my own personal hunts until after the first of the year, because at that point our crop rotation is pretty much settled, and I know for a fact what our winter wheat situation looks like. I know for a fact where the birds are, and I have a better handle of what the population looks like. But I can tell you, I am very excited for next year because I was extremely pleasantly surprised at the number of jakes that we in fact had this year running around. And it was very interesting to see, and I've got some video footage, and I'm going to try to piece some of these together for the website. It was very clear to see some of the jakes, very large body size, 4-inch beard sticking out of their chest almost. I mean, a very prominent, small but prominent beard, very large body jake. They'd be out there strutting. They have a decent fan, and rather than the stereotypical center 4 feathers in the fan sticking up, your typical jake fan, it would be the center 8 feathers or center 10 feathers. So they actually were an older cohort that were, that successfully hatched and were raised from last spring. But then right on their heels, following right behind them, here's another group of jakes, and I mean, their beards are barely visible out of their chest. They're tiny little birds that look almost like a hen, and when they strutted, it might have been 2 feathers. So these things are weeks to months behind their buddies, which makes sense since last year and the year before we've had just these bad weather cycles and predators, raccoons and skunks and possums and whatnot that raid a nest and cause a hen to have to re-nest. So, but the number of jakes that we had running around every single property that we hunted, that I managed, had groups of jakes running around, which is awesome because those are our 2-year-olds for next year. And given the fact that so far we have had a mild spring, yes, it's been dry. Yes, we've had a couple thunderstorms, but in our area, those thunderstorms have just simply dumped rain and wind and no hail, no snow, no just real severe weather. We should have nest success, barring any issues with coons and skunks and everything else. If the hen brings off that clutch, they should be pretty darn good, sizable, healthy birds this year. So I know we've got a good number of mature birds because I've seen them out there just when I was working on my food plot stuff and getting some other stuff prepped. There we've got a number of good mature birds out there. I know we've got a number of 2-year-olds that we've left out there. And now next year we have a pile of jakes that are going to all be our 2-year-olds. Next year, if our crop rotation is good and if we can break out of this kind of drought cycle to where our crop rotation goes back to, quote-unquote, what it should be, oh, man, is next year going to be fun. Yeah.
It's always fun to have something to look forward to. I got a chance on my Gould's hunt, so we were down there for almost 30 days. Of course, you were there with us last spring. Got a chance, Billy Yargis, a 3-time NWTF turkey calling, Grand National Turkey Calling champion, actually came down and harvested 2 birds. And it was a real delight for me to get to, for about 4 or 5 days, I just went around with him and got to listen to him, how he worked birds, how he called birds. And I was telling you yesterday when we were trying to set up a time for this podcast, one thing that jumped out at me was Billy is such a good caller as far as authentic, sounds, good cadence, great timing, and knows when to call, when not to call, what have you. One thing that kind of struck me is that when we would have birds roosted from the night before and we would get in there real early, pitch black, let everything settle, Billy would actually, and I kind of want your opinion on this, you hear the tree calling and you hear all the different strategies that we've heard historically over the years and what have you, of, give them a couple calls and then just shut up. Billy seemed to do the exact opposite. He seemed to be having conversations with individual hens in the tree as well as gobblers. And Chris, he could, with a high end, kind of a front end, high end or a high front end yelp, kind of a yelp, 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 real sweet. He'd be talking to one hen, and then he'd switch the very next series of calls. He would switch to an old mature hen, and bow, 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 and it was crazy. I mean, I videoed it. I put it up on my YouTube. But once those hens would start up in the tree, he just had a constant conversation back and forth. I'm talking totally opposite of what we've all read. So yeah. I'm curious, and with great success. He would call birds directly out of the tree, directly to him, gobblers and hens. And I asked him about it, and he's like, if you're having a conversation with someone and then you just shut up and you don't answer back and they keep calling, your buddy keeps asking or they keep shouting out and you're not answering, they think you left or they think you're, pissed off or something, and they end up probably just saying to heck with it. I'm curious your thoughts on, me witnessing Billy calling a ton to those birds in the tree. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think Billy and I would get along marvelously because, I agree. I mean, because the other thing, too, is, his analogy, I'm fine with it. But, as a wildlife guy, the other flip side is you think about it behaviorally. Okay, you're a turkey in the tree. you hear another turkey that sounds like she's on the ground or over there somewhere, maybe she's close to the ground or whatever, and here we are talking back and forth, and all of a sudden the one that's over there that's kind of on the ground all of a sudden just goes dead quiet. Well, the only reason why a turkey goes dead quiet is, did a bobcat come through? Is a coyote over there? Did some other predator come through? Did they, is something wrong? What caused them? Because otherwise they're going to be down there milling around, even if they're not flat, yep, and they're going to be down there scratch, and purr, and brr, brr, There's going to be activity there that those birds on the limb are going to be able to continue to hear. It is literally very similar to what I tell people, whether it's elk calling or whether it's turkey calling. Once those animals continue to, they respond, they're moving your way, and all of a sudden you've gotten within that particular range where you say, you know what, I need to set up. There's some people that just at that point they're like, oh, he's close, I'm going to get set up, I'm going to stop calling, and I'm going to let him come find me. Well, if you've had that conversation for that entire time, and then all of a sudden you go, no pun intended, cold turkey, just you're done. You're all of a sudden dead silent. A lot of times you're going to put that other animal on edge. You're going to be like, what the heck? Where the heck did they go? Especially if they start coming in a little bit closer, looking and gobble at you or bugle at you or whatever. They're going, okay, I was just talking to someone over here. Where are you? And you don't move. You don't say anything. In their mind, the animal, whatever animal was just there that they were talking to, has left. Either has left or is standing like a stone statue because there's probably a predator somewhere around. And that's typically when the turkeys, you see them fold those wings up over their backs. They start flip, fold those wings up, turn around and walk away. Or that's when you get an elk that just all of a sudden they start swinging around downwind. They start using their nose. I agree, absolutely. If you start that conversation, continue the conversation. Now, I'm sure Billy's the same way. If the birds on the tree are just they want to talk, then I'm going to talk. But if they are just, really quiet and they're really not not fired up, while they're on the tree, I'm probably going to just kind of keep that same temperature, if you will, that kind of same momentum. But once they hit the ground, or more importantly, if I think they have a potential to fly out in a different direction, no, I'm going to start picking it up a minute because I'm trying, and I'm sure Billy's the same way, I'm trying to put in their mind that, hey, yes, I'm a turkey over here, but I'm talking with you. I'm engaging you. I feel if I'm engaging you and I'm on the ground, then obviously if I'm on the ground, I feel safe. And if I'm going to be yapping my gums like I am, I obviously feel confident and safe, and there's no problem. And if I step that up, it sounds like Billy was, basically sounded like two different hens, but it almost sounded like what you and I had talked about before a long time ago about that low and slow, that no, where you got those older, mature hens just saying, hey, I'm over here, come here, this is where everybody needs to be, and get that flock to fly out. I get criticized all the time. Heck, you can watch on one of my YouTube videos with actually, it's funny, with Steve, with the guy we were just talking about. Steve's Turkey Hunt is on YouTube, and you'll see a couple comments in there where people are like, oh my gosh, you were calling way too much, and you're lucky you even killed that bird. But why? Because I was just hammering. Even the birds that were on the roost, I was calling to them, and when they flew down, I was hammering them. You got 30 birds on a roost and a handful of gobblers, and they fly down 100 yards away from you. You either better convince that flock that they need to be over there and battle them, or at least convince one or two of those gobblers to break away. Otherwise, they're just going to go off and do their own thing. So, no, I agree with Billy. I agree with that tactic. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Do you think that that's that tactic of a couple of soft tree calls and then shut up is because it kind of stemmed from maybe guys that don't sound as realistic, they don't sound as good, and over time they realized they called too much and those birds figured them out. I mean, I can see how if you don't sound realistic, if you don't have the proper cadence and timing, like how you could make the conclusion that, hey, I need to not call as much, and hey, one time I called 2 times and they all flew down right to me, so therefore that's the way to do it. I mean,
yes,
I think that's what happened. I think, it's just over time, people that maybe weren't the greatest callers, and you don't have to be a great caller to kill turkeys, but obviously if your cadence and timing is off, you can screw a lot of things up by overcalling.
And I agree with you, and I think, and this is not to be just maliciously cutting and overly critique of people's abilities, but I help people all the time, and that is one of the things that consistently, and it sounds so stinking basic, and it is, but it's one of the things that's hard for people to wrap their head around is the cadence of, especially when we're talking yelps, the cadence matters. It matters. And so you need to spend time listening to hens, and when you call, whether it's a box call or a pot call or a mouth call, you need to have the correct cadence. And if you're going to do a yelp, you like you said, you don't have to be the best caller in the world. I talk about, whether you're an effective caller, an efficient caller, or, professional caller, whatever you want to call it. You don't have to be a phenomenal caller. But the people that are consistently successful are those people that understand the fundamentals of, okay, the cadence needs to be right. And when I do a yelp, there does need to be that high part of the yelp, and there does need to be a shoulder. There needs to be a point where that breaks over. There's some people that when they call, they may have the cadence right, but it just sounds like these flat chopstick, just dot, 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 dot. It's not realistic. I don't care if it's high pitch, low pitch. There's some birds that like that high frequency. There are some birds that like lower, raspier. That's all the kind of nuance to the birds you're working, or if you want to sound like multiple birds. But every bird is going to have the same fundamental building blocks of that vocalization, and if you can get that, or make sure that's in there, you're going to go a long way. And I think you're right. I think in some cases, especially if we're talking about public land, where those birds are hearing many, many different callers, but many of those callers are not authentic sounding. Doesn't have to be dead on, Billy Yargus national champion perfect, but it's not authentic sounding, then those birds are going to become very educated very quickly, and they're just going to pitch out and go the other way. And so I agree with you that maybe during the bulk of the season, in some cases, the reason why people do better with just a couple soft tree yelps and then a couple clucks and a couple purrs is because those sounds are sounds that they can make that actually sound authentic, that don't tip the turkeys off, and the turkeys want to fly down and come. And most of the time when I hear people saying that that's how they call, a lot of times those birds are coming in cautiously. And they're just coming in slowly, and they're just looking, maybe strutting, and they have to work them slow and call them in cautiously and slow. Now, if we're talking about later in the season, well, it may not even be the fact that that other people in the area haven't been calling authentically. In some cases, I will still do the exact same thing where maybe all I'm going to use is clucks and purrs to get a bird to come in, simply because whether it's the time of day or whether it's just the time of season where the hens just are not active, the hens are off on their own, they don't care about breeding, they don't care about other hens, they don't care about being together. Okay, in those situations, maybe aggressive, what most people quote unquote would consider aggressive style calling, is not what that bird is going to be accustomed to hearing at the time, so maybe it's going to set him off a little bit where a cluck and purr and subtle calling is going to be a little bit more effective. That, by all means, that happens. But I think you're right. I think a lot of people sell themselves short on the experiences that they may be able to experience out in the field simply because they just haven't quite gotten to the point where they've been able to master some of the fundamentals of the calling that they're doing to where they just don't sound quite authentic enough. I've got guys that come to, again, if you're in Mississippi and you're dealing with heavily pressured birds or you're dealing with, doesn't matter. Yes, understand there's going to be different tactics for different birds, and I tell people this all the time, but, they'll come out to Kansas and hunt Rios with me, and they want to call. I usually give them about the first 10, 15 minutes, and I'm like, all right, let me call for a little bit. Let me show you what I do, and then you can take. And I'll start calling, and they look at me like I am from Mars. And what are you doing? I'm like, just sit back, enjoy the ride, get your gun on your shoulder, and get ready. And every time the first bird comes in and they get the first hunt under their belt, they go, goodness gracious, I've never seen that. I've never witnessed that. I've never even experienced that. Well, I think some people do, in fact, sell themselves short, and they don't ever try to call a little bit more frequently or a little bit more aggressively because they've been told that it doesn't work. And I think they're missing out on some A success and just awesome encounters,
Yeah, I kind of had a situation this year on the Gould hunt and it typically happens with guys that are from the Southeast or, New York, Pennsylvania, kind of in that country where they call they say they want to do the calling, and I'm like, okay. And they call twice, and then they sit there for an hour.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking in my mind, okay, this isn't going to work.
This isn't going to happen.
Maybe if a bird just happens to walk in, it might happen. But you have to broadcast. And I believe that you can overcall at times. But it is interesting to see the different strategies for sure. I want to switch gears here for a second. A couple things I've been watching on your Instagram and on your Facebook, all the stuff you've been doing with getting your properties ready. But before we get into that, there is a picture on your Instagram, and for those listeners out there, Roe Hunting Resources, that's ROE, so it's at Roe Hunting Resources. Chris, you're holding a beard that looks just like a frickin' paintbrush. What's the status with that?
Dude, he was a 2-year-old.
Are you kidding me?
No, I'm not. That's one of the birds I was talking about. Okay, so again, remember I told you that there's that group of 5 birds traveling together, all right? So all preseason, I'm watching these birds. And these birds are actually using a field that an outfitter has. We have all the river bottom. We have all of the roost areas. We have all of, and this is a longer discussion for another day, but regardless, we do all the food plots. We do all the intensive management, the habitat improvements. I'm watching the how many birds we have and what the population, and I'm regulating how many hunters we're taking out there and how many birds we're going to take. I'm doing all that on my side of the fence. Meanwhile, on the other side of the fence, an outfitter has leased the ground, and over the past couple of years, he's kind of realized that what he's got on that fence line, and so he's just slowly worked his way to this point. This year, he put his ground blind literally as physically close to the roost site as possible, and just dumped a corn pile in the field in front of the ground blind, and so he could just try to kill every bird that he could get over that fence line. Well, I'm watching these birds. Well, they ended up putting some oats in this field, and so these birds finally started using this field. And I'm thinking, great, this guy, they're just gonna slaughter him. So I changed how we, manage the property and how we hunt the property, and et cetera. And so I went in there one day, and I'm like, you know what? I'd really like to try to see if we can't get one of these birds on the ground, because they're just giants. They're, like you said, they're just, you can, from a distance in a spotting scope or binoculars, you look at them and you just like, sit there and you go, oh my gosh, they're just huge beards, just giant-bodied birds. I'm thinking they've got to be 4-year-old birds or better, So I get set up. I get in, I was getting in there. I go to get set up. These birds are already in the field, so all I can do is sneak into one of my ground blinds that's in there. I didn't even have any chairs in the ground blind. Luckily, I've got most of it on camera. So I get in there and I sit. Now, again, these are 5 big birds locked down with I think there was 3 hens in the field that day, but they're just locked down with 2 hens typically. They didn't respond to anything. They're just not doing anything. Well, I end up calling in a Jake. Okay, so I set out a small decoy spread just because where I was set up, when the wind starts blowing, this particular spot is a very well-known, or for me, it's a well-known, well-used, that's better, but well-used loafing area that birds will move into this little shady spot where it's protected out of the wind, and midday it can work really good, and that's why I went there. Well, the wind died, the weather was beautiful. These things aren't going to leave this field all day. But I had a couple decoys out, just an upright hen and the Jake decoy. And so I'm sitting there, and these birds are out in the field. I'm like, well, I'm just going to have to wait until, it starts getting hot, and then they want to move into the shade, and maybe I'll have a chance. Well, a Jake gobbled in the river bottom in front of me. Didn't know it was a Jake, but a bird gobbled. So I start calling. Sure enough, I call him in. It's a Jake. I'm like, all right, no wrong. Well, that Jake comes into the decoy spread and starts to try to climb onto the hen decoy. And as soon as he starts trying to breed the hen decoy, and he's spinning around trying to figure out how to get, I even looked right in the camera. I was like, oh, this could happen. I said, those birds out in that field see this activity in front of my blind, and they see a Jake or another Tom trying to breed a hen. This might be over. Dude, I literally, I think it was 10, 15 minutes after that. It may have been longer. The Jake was in front of my blind working that decoy over for a long time. And literally, I'm sitting there waiting, and all of a sudden the Jake I see him stop. He slowly just moves away from the hen. His head goes up a little bit. I'm like, oh, something's changing. And right about that time, they gobble, and they are like 3 feet from the back of the blind. I'm in the blind scrambling now, trying to, these things got under the wire. They about tripped over the guy wire of the anchor of the blind. All of those birds come walking in there, but now they're full strut, and they're walking, and they're kind of walking, and now it's just chaos. You got 5 birds chasing each other, chasing the Jake. Some of them are over at the decoys. Some of them are running around, and meanwhile, I'm trying to get the camera on them. They're only 15 yards at this point, and so I've got full choke and everything. I'm like, oh, goodness gracious. So I did. There was a couple birds in there that had the biggest beard, and they had the prettiest, Rio Grande coloration, and they had a good full fan. There was one in there that had a couple busted feathers in the tail fan. I remember this from last year. How many hunters do you get that they'll pass on a bird because it didn't have a perfect tail fan? So I knew one of these 2 birds was going to be the ones I wanted to take it. So as soon as that one head cleared, I just crushed him. Not once stopping to take a look at his spurs. Now, the grass at that point is probably a little too tall. I don't even know if I would have seen his spurs, but I didn't even think about it because they were so big. I'm like, oh yeah, these are older birds. I'm gonna crush him. I'm gonna run up there, and he's gonna have 1 1/4 inch hooks. I walk up there, and he's got maybe 3/4 inch spurs.
Wow, from the beard. Holy smokes, that thing. Yeah. That just goes to show you, though. Spurs, truly the best indication of age, I think.
And yes, they are, but you and I both know, even that can be kind of inconsistent. It's an unfortunate reality. Some birds just don't. We had one of our hunters killed, I think, one of the biggest birds. I think it was a 10.5-inch beard, and this bird had to have been pushing 24 pounds, 20 or something like that. Just a giant. His spurs look like quarter-inch nubs. They look like Jake's spurs. He just didn't grow any, But no, I have no regrets. I mean, that bird was a giant. I mean, big fan, big old honking beard on him. Yeah, it was fun, but that just goes to show you, sometimes, it takes, like that, just that Jake coming in there working that hen is what made that happen. But, a bird in good habitat can, they can grow 4.5, 5 inches of beard a year. So, I mean, heck, you can get a 2-year-old bird that's got a 10-inch beard if everything's going right. So,
I don't know if I've asked you this question before, but it was something else that I learned this year. I don't know what I was thinking before, and maybe you can fill me in, maybe maybe you don't, but when a gobbler loses their primary feathers out of their tail fan, so when a bird comes in, he's full strut and like he's missing 3 feathers in a row, and there's a big gap in his tail fan or whatever, if he's missing 1 feather, I didn't realize that they'll just grow those back in. And that's kind of dumb on my part, but I had several guys say, no, I mean, they'll just grow those feathers back. Do you know, Chris, like what time of year that if they lose those primary feathers that they will regrow those feathers?
Yeah, they'll molt twice a year. Now, and there's a difference here. There's the molt that they do. They actually replace every single feather on their body twice a year. So they'll go into, they'll molt in the summer, and then they'll molt, and they'll have a new set of, they'll molt in the kind of the fall winter when they'll get a new set of feathers, all nice and shiny, ready to go for spring. That's why Jake feathers in their tail fan look the way they do. Those center feathers that are longer than the other ones are their new adult feathers. They just haven't molted out of the spring molt. They haven't molted out of those baby feathers, and as summer goes on, they'll just keep growing. They'll grow those other feathers. But if the tail feather, if a feather breaks and the quill is still intact and healthy, no, they will not grow that feather until they molt and they shed it out. However, if a tail feather, from my understanding, if a feather gets plucked out to where the quill gets removed, that is when it will stimulate a new feather to come in and regrow. That is what I know. I'm not an ornithologist, so maybe I'm wrong on that. But as far as I've known, that's if a quill gets plucked, it'll grow a new one back. If it just gets broken, it'll wait until they molt it out.
Okay, because that leads me to my second question of Billy, actually, his second bird, the second, I'm going to call them the secondary feathers, and you can correct me on my, terminology, but, you've got your primary fan, and then you have on the Goulds those beautiful white secondary feathers that are,
the saddle feathers or whatever.
Yeah. Well, you know how, like, from the white band on the Goulds, like the next band down is usually another nice band in its own right?
Yes.
Well, Billy shot a bird, and we didn't realize it. I mean, he strutted, but, he basically had 6 or 8 of those feathers completely gone. So when you actually look at his photo, that secondary band, and I'm curious what would make that, those 6 or 8 feathers just completely gone. Here's your thoughts.
Actually, a number of things. I mean, if that bird had been fighting and another bird jumped up and kicked at him and he kind of flinched and turned, I mean, as well as I do, sometimes, you shoot a bird and he starts flopping. Well, some of those feathers just go everywhere. He easily could have been scrapping with another bird. Another bird jumped up, kicked at him. He flinched, and when that bird's feet came down and raked across his back, it just could have just pulled some of those feathers out. Who knows? The other thing, that would be my guess of why, if they truly were completely missing, that would be my guess of why they were missing. I've seen, where maybe a coyote or something has gone after him and launched at him and tried to grab a mouthful, and all of a sudden, he's got half a fan, The other thing too, though, and it'd be very interesting to see the picture, and I noticed this, over the years I've noticed, but I always pay attention to this when I am trying to prep someone's tail fan for them or show them how to prep their tail fan. Those saddle feathers are in there fairly loose. The skin that they are plugged into, if you will, is very loose. And so sometimes those feathers can get off-center. They can get tucked off to the left or tucked off to the right and actually just kind of buried and hidden in under other saddle feathers. And it's not until you kind of lift all those saddle feathers up, kind of give it a shake and let things kind of settle back that oh, wait a minute, nope, that feather, oh, there it is, okay, it kind of got just messed up in the fray and just kind of got tucked, under, some of the other saddle feathers, or just got tucked off to the side of the other saddle feathers. Sometimes just with the bird flopping around on the ground, it can lose feathers, or they get pushed up underneath some of those other deeper, bigger feathers, and you just kind of got to go search for them. But my guess is either it lost him when it was, if the bird did not flop when he killed it, my guess is he probably lost him in a fight somewhere.
Yeah, good stuff. I want to take just a second here, Chris, and thank the sponsors of this podcast. I want to thank Go Hunt Insider. They have been the title sponsor of this podcast since I started it over 3 years ago. I want to thank Go Hunt Insider. I want to encourage you guys, if you're not a Go Hunt Insider member, you can use the J. Scott promo code, and you're going to get a $50 Go Hunt Gear Shop gift card immediately credited to your account. You can immediately buy something. If you haven't heard about the Go Hunt Insider, in my opinion, they are the best Western hunting resource and tool to use when applying for all these Western states. Make sure to check them out. Make sure to use the J. Scott promo code. I want to thank them for their sponsorship. Also, KUIU.com, KUIU.com. KUIU makes, in my opinion, the best ultralight hunting gear available on the market today. And the Outdoorsman's, outdoorsmans.com. If you use the J. Scott promo code at outdoorsmans.com, you're going to get a 10% discount. If you call them 1-800-291-8065, you're going to get a 10% discount if you use the J. Scott promo code as well. Guys, we've got some other sponsorship things coming up that I'm going to be announcing over this next month. Some exciting stuff going on here. I want to thank each and every one of you for your support of this podcast. And like always, if you have any questions of me, you can email me at jscottoutdoors@gmail.com. I appreciate you guys following along on my Instagram account. That's at jscottoutdoors. Chris, you have been doing some great posts on your Instagram and on your Facebook, and I'm excited to see kind of the interaction that you're having while you're prepping some of your different properties. Talk a little bit about what's going on within Roe Hunting Resources and what you do, your day job and what you've been doing over the last couple weeks, and I encourage the listeners to go check it out.
Yeah, so we've talked about, everybody probably by this point knows all my stuff that I do with elk, and still that's continuing and going on. But, I'm a wildlife biologist, and I help private landowners manage their land for wildlife. And so the stuff that I do in Kansas, the reason why I'm in Kansas, is to help a couple landowners with wildlife management stuff and the hunting stuff that's going on their property. Well, some people... And this is to your point of what I've been starting to put on social media, is a little bit more details of what it is I'm actually doing out here. It's just not me dinking around. There's a kind of a purpose of what I'm doing. And it's kind of a longer discussion, and people can go to, like I said, it's ROE, Roe Hunting Resources on social media, and you can dive into some of this stuff, especially on the Roe Hunting Resources Facebook page. All the videos are there, and you can kind of go back through and watch. But some people, we're in an area in Kansas where we have agriculture, but there are some things going on with agriculture these days that are changing. It's not the same that was going on, say, 10 years ago. And so there's a lot of people that say, I've hunted, Kansas for X number of years and blah, 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 blah. We always shoot big deer, and it's great deer, blah. Yeah, that's fine. But there's a lot of people, especially even locals, that are starting to sit there and go, well, wait a minute, I'm not seeing the numbers that we saw before. I'm just not seeing the quality that we kind of saw 10 years ago. I just don't see the number of turkeys. What's going on? Well, if you start looking at the landscape, there's a couple of things that are, in fact, changing, and those changes, although they might be subtle and you don't really notice it, those changes are having impact on, at least in my area, the population of animals we're dealing with. So, for instance, we've got a different crop rotation, commodity prices, whether you're talking wheat, corn, soybean, those prices these days are completely different than what they were 5 years ago, 7 years ago, 10 years ago. And so now, to the point, it's almost impossible to even pencil in a profit margin on growing wheat. So a lot of people don't want to, a lot of farmers are going, gee, I'm not going to grow wheat because there's no money in it. However, you've heard me talk about all the time, winter wheat is king. When we're talking about early season in the fall or nice weather during the winter, the deer are going to pile in on the winter wheat. And in the spring, if you've got winter wheat, you've got turkeys. Well, it's not just because it's tasty stuff. It's because it actually has a very, very high nutrient content to it. And it, from a physiological standpoint, those birds and the deer actually need that food. They need that forage, especially in our area where we don't have a lot of native vegetation. Like I said, I'm here in eastern Kansas. I just finished this morning. I just finished looking at a gentleman's property. Came out, did an evaluation for him. We're on the east. His property's on the east side of the Flint Hills of Kansas. Anybody knows about the Flint Hill? It's just an absolute gorgeous chunk of just region of Kansas. Well, there's just gigantic white oaks and red oaks and just there's so much just food, native vegetation and food for the deer. Well, in my area, that ain't it. I mean, most of the deer and turkeys are almost 100% dependent upon agriculture throughout the year. So winter wheat is extremely important as far as a high-quality forage component on the landscape. Well, if all of a sudden 90% of the farmers are no longer growing winter wheat, well, you just pulled a huge chunk of food off the table. And then people that only come to Kansas in October, November, December, well, they see all the cornfields, and they see all the corn in the fields, and they see all the deer that are out in the cornfields, and the turkeys that are out in the cornfields. They're like, oh, well, this is great. We've got all these deer out in the cornfields and these big cornfield, corn-fed bucks, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, that's fine. But if you really look at things from a standpoint of a year-round rotation, corn, you plant corn, let's just say in a great year you plant corn starting about April 19th or 20th, and you can get corn in the ground. Well, when corn comes out of the ground, the field that the corn is getting planted into can't have anything in it. So they've already, just from a competition standpoint, from a crop management standpoint, they're going to use either herbicide, they're going to till it, they're going to disc it, whatever. They're going to prep that field, which means they essentially wipe the slate clean. There's no food on it. So in April, there's no food. At least April, there's really no food on that field. And then they plant the crop in the end of April, beginning middle of May maybe, and then the corn starts coming up. Well, if you look at the corn plant, the corn plant doesn't have a lot of it's not very nutrient beneficial for deer, and it's almost 100% worthless for turkeys. So you've got May, June, July, August, September, where that corn plant really isn't providing any food whatsoever, not really high-quality food. Once the plant produces an ear, okay, then you got some food there. But even then, you look at in some cases, our farmers are finding that they actually have better marketability. There's better money in harvesting what's called wet corn. So it's a high moisture corn. Well, if you have a high moisture corn, meaning the ear of corn still has a lot of moisture in it, well, that ear of corn isn't going to shed, and the ears of corn aren't going to just fall on the ground. And when the corn falls over, the kernels of corn aren't going to pop out of the cob. So when they harvest, quote-unquote, wet corn, there's almost nothing left in the field. And so even though you planted corn, you think, okay, well, October, November, December, it's going to be out. No, you might as well have taken a shop vac out in the field and sucked up every kernel because it's just dirt and stalk. So now you say, okay, well, that field didn't grow anything of high-quality food for the deer throughout the year. Well, now it's got nothing in the field for them in the fall and winter. Okay, well, there's corn. Well, now we've got a lot of people planting corn because at least there's money in corn. And corn only utilizes moisture for a short window of time. So when we're in these drought years, these dry years, corn actually is a better crop to grow. So now all of a sudden you've got these just thousands of acres of corn. Put on top of that incentives by farm services to, if you want to get crop insurance, they will give you a better rate if you plant more acres in one crop. So we've got kind of this perfect storm of situations where, because of just farmers trying to, and I'm telling you that the profit margin on farming is just razor thin. People don't realize the costs that it goes to. They're literally looking on a per acre basis on if they can make money off of, they say they put a couple tens of thousands of dollars in on fertilizer and seed and herbicide and everything else, and they raise that crop. Let's just say it's a decent crop. They're hoping the commodity prices when they go to sell it are enough to where they make a couple dollars on the back end per acre, to where they're going, okay, I come out ahead. But I'm telling you that people don't realize just how razor thin some of the agricultural markets are, to where farmers are trying to just survive and pay bills and do the best they can. And so they have to change the way they do their agriculture on the landscape, which is, people are still very responsible. There's very responsible herbicide management, very responsible fertilizer management, very responsible crop rotations, but it's just that crop rotations have changed a little bit. Granted, we've got soybean. Soybean that's your ticket. Soybean is it's like a superfood for deer. But soybean requires a lot of moisture. And so if you're in a dry year, maybe you're not going to plant a lot of soybean. So I say all of that because if folks just simply come out and hunt a week out of the year, you don't really get to see everything else that went into actually producing the whitetail that you want to go after, or the turkey that you want to chase in the field. So because of all those changes, we're starting to see, does that they're not having twins or triplets, they're having one fawn. Deer that are going through the summer literally skin and bones. You can see the ribs, you can see the shoulder blades, you can see their hip bones, and they look emaciated because they just don't have quality food. And that triggers this whole other, I'm going to talk about this here coming up on my social media stuff, is the epigenetic effects, not just genetic, epigenetic effects, where the environment, their nutritive state, and how they were born, and the condition of their mother when they were born, all these things can flip a switch on or off, or whether or not that animal is actually going to manifest the genetic potential it even has. So all these things considered, I sit there and I look at where I manage and I say, okay, how do I allow the landowner to do what they need to do? They have to pay their bills. They have bills. They have to pay them. They have to make a living just like I do, just like listeners do. I want to make sure that they can pay their bills, but how can I then go and either incentivize them to change maybe a field edge here or a field edge there, and maybe we just leave some crop, or maybe we change and put a food plot in, or maybe we take that piece of pasture that is not really productive, and that's probably what you've seen recently. I went in and I was talking about converting an actual active piece of cattle pasture into a food plot. But I'm not removing that pasture from active cattle grazing. The area of this cattle pasture turned into nothing but cheatgrass and hemp. So from a ranching standpoint, from a cattle production standpoint, that chunk of real estate was doing nothing for the rancher. But I can go in and I can convert that to, say, a winter wheat field. The cattle are in that pasture prior to me getting ready to plant the winter wheat. The winter wheat goes in. I can provide a good benefit for deer and turkeys from fall into the winter and then into the spring. However, about the time the winter wheat starts to mature, that's when he wants to put his cattle in there. Well, now we can turn the cattle in, and now rather than just an area of just dead cheatgrass and hemp, now he'll actually have something that has forage quality for him. So I can provide a win-win for that landowner. We've got a win on his cattle grazing in the range quality, and I've got a win from the wildlife side. So that's kind of what I'm doing on our landscape, and I'm always trying to see, can I start to offset our agriculture, our crop rotation, and make sure that I can provide a high-quality, high-nutrient forage 365 days of the year. Get in relation to what the crop rotation is. And that is what I'm showcasing now. That is what I'm doing. So like I said, I just went and reviewed this gentleman's property and gave him some pointers. Literally, I have here in 30 minutes, I'm going to be doing a turkey seminar, an elk hunting seminar for the Elk Foundation folks. And then tomorrow, I turn right around. I'm headed to another property, and I'll be posting some stuff on there. I'm helping another gentleman reclaim an existing food plot that just turned into nothing but weeds because it just wasn't done properly to begin with. And then he's got another property that is completely virgin, has never had agriculture on it, at least not in decades. So we're going to go in and take a look and see if we can't put some food plots in there and start to provide year-round beneficial forage for his deer and turkey. So that all is being showcased on my social media right now. And then once I get done with those couple projects, that's when I just dive right back into my elk stuff for the later part of the summer.
Yeah, and Chris, I might add, later this month, we don't have an exact date scheduled yet, but Chris and I are going to try and answer the listeners, you guys' questions, and most of the questions that we're going to be answering are going to be pertaining to elk hunting, elk calling, and what have you. If you guys are listening to this episode right now and your mind is already, like most of us, already starting to think about elk, and you've got strategy questions, you've got tactics questions, you've got behavior questions, whatever it may be in regards to elk, you're going to have a chance to ask Chris and I, be on a conversation and have some bounce back with Chris and I. So if you're interested in having a discussion with Chris and I on this podcast, you can send either one of us, but probably for now, just send me the questions and I'll forward them to Chris. And as this plan of ours gets a little more formulated, we're going to be probably both talking about it on our Instagram account, so you guys will know exactly when this is going to go down, and then I will be turning that podcast around and so that everybody can hear it. And we may have to do a couple of them because I assume we're going to have quite a few questions and we're going to try and do several throughout the summer. Chris, don't you think some guys are going to get some real value out of not just asking a question and then us answering, but having the option to ask questions and follow-up questions in a discussion style that everybody can get some value out of? As far as elk hunting, I think it's going to be a great thing that people get a lot of value from.
Yeah, absolutely. And like we talked about yesterday, it's even given the fact that I've got the elk module and there's so much information in there, people are constantly asking questions and just clarification and just concepts and that type of stuff. So yeah, absolutely. If you got questions, let's hash through them. And I think it's going to be a fun type of scenario that we can do. So like I said, if you can run those logistics, I say let's do it.
Yeah, so guys, send your questions, or if you want to say, yes, I'd like to ask some questions, I'll put you on our list. You can email me at jscottoutdoors@gmail.com, and we'll do the best we can in getting a lot of those questions answered. And, of course, Chris, Roe Hunting Resources, you've been around for a long time and providing a lot of value to people in the elk module, in a bunch of the different tutorials within the Roe Hunting Resources. Chris, for those listeners out there that maybe haven't heard you on this podcast, maybe they're a new listener, let's conclude here and talk about what Roe Hunting Resources does and the value that you provide to your subscription base, and just basically be talking to the new listener so that they're aware of it.
Sure. So what you've heard Jay and I talk about so far, from my day, if you call it my day job, the work that I do, getting my hands dirty, is a lot of on the ground habitat stuff. And so yes, I'm out here working with deer, and I'm literally this here at the end of the month, I'm headed up to look at elk ranch, elk property for elk hunting, and there's some habitat concerns there. So I'm looking up, that's up in North Dakota, up in the Badlands up there. So I do a lot of consulting. So if people are, obviously, if you've got help, if you need help with deer and stuff, especially if you're in the Kansas area or whatever, give me a call. But when it comes to education, when it comes to a lot of the elk stuff that I do from a calling, a behavior standpoint, that I'm very, very strong in the behavioral sciences and why behavior matters, why their vocalizations matter, what they're saying, why they're saying it, when they're saying it. All of that information I've got under the roehuntingresources.com, and you'll see there's a subscription base. It's the elk module. And I was talking to Kelly, my wife, today. I think we've got, it's got to be pushing almost 40 hours. I know it's over 30 hours, but it may be almost 40 hours of educational video in that elk module, talking about everything that I can think about, from vocalizations, behavior, tactics, how I use that stuff. So and this is important for anybody who's listening that has been a member even in previously, we have updated that website. So now it is 100% mobile friendly. It doesn't matter what device you're using. You can watch it on your phone, your iPad, tablet. It doesn't matter. It's all optimized for mobile use. And you've got several different categories and really focuses in there. So I start with the basics, the beginning. We go through the fundamentals. There's the basically kind of getting started videos that go through my philosophy, what I'm thinking, why I think it, what some of the underlying, how should you go about going through the elk module, what do you need to focus on, what, how to pick it apart, how to use it as a tool. Then the recognition series, the fundamental foundation of, what are cow vocalizations? What are those building blocks of vocalizations that cows do? What do they mean? Why? And it's not me just flapping my gums about it. It's heavily intensive on elk doing whatever it is that I'm talking about. So if I'm going to be talking about a particular behavior or a vocalization, at some point there's going to be an elk standing in front of you on video with good audio, good video, boom, doing it in front of you. So you can see this is them doing it. And then the next step in that progression then is recognition. Okay, so now that I understand what a lost mew is versus an assembly mew versus a whine versus this type of mew or that type of bull vocalization, we have a chunk in there that is nothing but what I call the gallery. It's just nothing but elk doing what elk are doing. There's no calling involved. No person, no human calling involved. There's no interference trying to make the elk do anything. These are just me videoing elk interacting with themselves, each other, their environment, and in some cases, other factors like other traffic or other people around or whatever, but you get to see what those animals are doing, but you can then recognize, okay, Chris talked about this vocalization. I just heard it there. He talked about this behavior. There, I get to see it there. So it allows you to kind of watch elk, watch their behavior without any pressure of trying to hunt, because there's so many times when we're on a hunt, we focus on the success of the hunt rather than soaking in all of the details that are unfolding in front of us. Well, the gallery lets you just sit and watch this all unfold so you can have a better understanding of what you're seeing when you go out to the field. And then you go from there to application, where you got the strategies in action. We've got the other hunting videos where you actually sit and watch me. We take all that information. Here's the vocalizations we talked about. Here's the behavior we talked about. Okay, come along. I've got the camera. Let's go. Bull bugle over here. This is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to get set up. This is how I'm going to call. This is why I'm going to call. This is why I'm going to say what I'm going to say. This is the outcome that I expect, or the reaction that I get or I expect. Let's see what happens. And then I work that setup and show you how I go about calling in elk and working setups. And then there are a handful of videos in there where it's me actually going out and having a hunt where I end up killing the elk. So there's a lot of different educational tools in that elk module. Again, though, it's all video-based, and it's all video-based, but it's heavy on elk video, elk themselves on video doing it, just not me flapping my gums about it. So that's what the elk module is.
Great stuff. How do they find it? How do they find you?
Anything that you want to find out about me, just type in Roe Hunting Resources, ROE Hunting Resources, and it'll come up. So roehuntingresources.com is the website. We have a YouTube channel, Roe Hunting Resources. There's a pile of YouTube videos, Instagram, Facebook. I am on Twitter, but Twitter's kind of I don't do a lot of active Twitter. It's just kind of a secondary thing. But Instagram, I'm on a lot, and Facebook, I'm on a lot. YouTube, and then roehuntingresources.com. So.
Awesome, buddy. Well, I know you've got that seminar to do here in a few minutes. I appreciate you taking some time with us here. Glad you had a great turkey season. Glad you're getting a little bit of rain here and there. I saw you got 2 inches the other day, and that was a welcome surprise. So hopefully all across the West here we need moisture. Hopefully we get some moisture this summer, and everybody's happy. Always great having you on the podcast. I look forward to this summer and doing some of this question and answer stuff with the listeners and being able to interact with our listeners here, and hopefully they'll find a lot of value in that. And so that'll be fun. And drive safe tonight on your way back home, and hope you have a great seminar. And I know those people are going to get some good stuff tonight.
Yeah, no, it should be really fun, and I think the focus of tonight is going to be what we just talked about, the fact that the weather conditions across this West, you look at Arizona and southwest Colorado, just how bad it is. We got fires burning in New Mexico right now. But then again, I were talking about the fact that, at least where you are in Colorado, there's at least a little bit of snow on the peaks. There's going to be such a wide array of environmental conditions, habitat quality conditions, whether it's water, whether it's vegetation. And what I'm going to be talking about tonight is going to be kind of diving into further detail on that series I have in the elk module. If you go into the elk module under the behavior stuff, you'll find it's called Rethinking the Rut, and I talk about all the factors that actually affect elk rut timing. A lot of people will say, "Oh, it's a late rut," and everybody always just says, "Well, it's just a late rut. It's a late rut." If they don't see the behavior or the activity that they expect, everybody just says, "Oh, they defer to it's a late rut." Well, I talk in that series that there's really only one thing that's going to make a rut end up happening late, but there's actually a number of things that can actually pull a cow to cycle in early. Well, those factors are largely environmental factors, and so what we're going to talk about tonight is we're going to dovetail off of that discussion, that rethinking the rut discussion, and actually put it on the ground and say, okay, if you're heading to northern Colorado and you've got this type of situation, well, understand that south central or southwest Colorado is probably going to be completely different. Arizona is going to be a real interesting one this year, and just for people that are getting ready to go out and scout. Maybe we're going to find out who drew tags here in Colorado come very shortly. But for people that are getting ready to start scouting this year, this discussion, I hope will help them kind of focus their efforts on what to actually scout and look for. Just don't walk around the mountain. Okay, I can camp here. Well, okay, but what are you noticing, and what you notice now, how do I interpret that of what it might do later on? Do I want to hunt early in the season? Do I want to hunt later in the season? Do I want to kind of, spread my season out a little bit? But that's the other thing. I guess that's the other thing, too, about the elk module, Jay, and you know this, is I'm going to record this seminar tonight, and then that will automatically get thrown into the elk module here coming up here in a week or two. So the elk module is kind of like an online library. As soon as you get a subscription, it opens the gate, and I just constantly keep adding, kind of books to the shelf, so to speak. And anything that I do, I record it, I put it on there, and that way people will have it. So if people are listening to this and they're going, dang it, I wish I could have been to the seminar, well, sign up to the elk module, and it'll be on there here shortly.
Right on, buddy. God bless you. I'll catch you later, okay?
All right, brother. Be safe. We'll talk soon.